My husband John and I are philanthropists. That word means different things to different people. To us, it means aggressive investments in a number of issue areas, from evidence-based policy to criminal justice, education, healthcare, pension reform, public accountability, and many more. I get asked a lot of questions about our work. Why did you choose the issue areas that you did, and how do you choose new ones? I always feel that when responding to that question, people are expecting me to tell a story about some transformative event that happened in my life or John's life that led us to embark on this path. Maybe they want to hear that we invest in healthcare because we've had family members who unfortunately have had cancer. Maybe they want to hear a story about my life growing up in Puerto Rico and how that fueled my interest in and passion for fighting social justice issues and addressing poverty. At TED, we've come to expect that every talk will start with a story like that. Something intensely moving and personal. Maybe something that starts with, when I was a kid. But I'm not going to tell a story like that, although I could. I think personal stories are so important. They are what fuels our passion. For many of us, they're the reason why we do the work we do. But I believe that they're precisely the wrong place to look for insight. In fact, I believe that we, as policymakers, government officials, philanthropists, even as individuals, spend entirely too much time on anecdote and not enough time on evidence. I'm here today to argue that we need to change that. That we're routinely making all kinds of decisions based on incomplete, inconsistent, flawed, or even non-existent data, based on anecdote. That this is harming all of us in ways that we're not appreciating, and that we can and should do better. Now, I've just made a bunch of provocative statements, so let me get to work at convincing you. I'll start with one example from the TED Global stage in 2012. The second most viewed TED Talk of all time, Amy Cuddy, psychologist, Harvard Business School professor, famous in large part for her TED Talk, for her work on power posing. So she basically argued that, and continues to argue, that standing in a power pose position, like Wonder Woman, like this, or like this, whatever makes you feel super powerful, changes the hormone levels in your body and might even be conducive to greater success. It's amazing, right? I mean, that's so cool. I should just stand like this the entire time. The TED community ate this up. Over 38 million views over the last 4.5 years. The talk has been subtitled into 48 languages and counting. Here's how the TED website today describes Professor Cuddy's work. It says that Professor Cuddy's work reveals the benefit of power posing. And it makes a reference to this hormone level issue that I just talked about. National news outlets gushed about the work. And many of us rushed to buy her best-selling book. Now, I hate to be a downer, but I think we were all duped. Power posing doesn't work, or at least not as advertised. Look at the myriad studies that have been conducted on power posing ever since Professor Cuddy released her findings. They point to glaring errors in her methodology. They question the entire theory of power posing. Some researchers tried to reproduce her work and couldn't. Others tried to reproduce her work and got exactly the opposite result, that power posing reduces feelings of power. And it gets worse. Even Professor Cuddy's co-author, who herself is a prominent academic, has completely disavowed the study. And she did so in no uncertain terms. Here's what she said: "I do not believe the power pose effects are real." And she goes farther than that. She confesses to glaring errors in the way that they conducted their study. Tiny sample sizes, flimsy data, selectively reported findings. Even Professor Cuddy herself, who continues to stand by the power pose theory, now has sort of amended her story, and now she says that she's agnostic about power pose's effects on hormone levels. Agnostic? That was the whole reason she went on the TED stage and did this and made us all do this and feel powerful. You might think this is a trite example, and it's by no means meant to be a personal attack. Who cares if I stand in front of you like this, if that makes me feel good or not? And what does that have to do with solving the country's problems and the world's problems, which is why we're all here? Well, a lot. Because this example is endemic of something that we see throughout academic research and throughout research in general. Virtually everywhere you look, you'll find researchers, many of them prominent, and most of them well-intentioned, actively misleading us into believing that bad research is proven fact. We've seen this time and again in our work. And when John and I started the foundation, we set out to solve the country's problems by attacking root causes. So we were pretty new at this, so we figured that the best place to start was to try to get our head around what we did and didn't know. As a community, collectively, as a country, what do we know about what does and doesn't work? After all, philanthropists have been trying to save the country and make the country better for many, many years and have spent billions of dollars doing it. Governments, state governments, local governments have spent exponentially more on healthcare programs, social programs, anti-poverty programs, job training, you name it. So we assumed that there had to be a massive body of evidence that could help guide our investment decisions. But what we found was really alarming. We saw bad research everywhere. It didn't matter where we looked. For example, we turned to nutrition as potentially an avenue to address our health epidemics. We wanted to get smart about what factors and foods might be conducive to chronic diseases, obesity, heart disease, diabetes. And we found some very good research, but we also found an abundance of studies like these. Chocolate makes you skinny. Oh, beer helps you work out, in case you didn't know. Coffee prevents Alzheimer's. Super catchy conclusions. A researcher notices that people in her study who are eating chocolate are also skinny and summarily comes to the conclusion, or at least tells us, that they're skinny because they eat chocolate. Same thing with an Alzheimer's study. Shoddy research, bad methodologies, small sample sizes, correlations touted as causations, selectively reported findings. Just like the Amy Cuddy study. By the way, there's a lot of these. One might say a lot of alternative facts. In 2012, a group of researchers randomly chose 50 ingredients from a cookbook. Normal stuff like milk, eggs. And they took a look at the body of research relating to these ingredients to see what they could learn about whether these ingredients did or did not cause cancer. Seems like a worthwhile exercise. Here's what they found. For every ingredient that you see listed in this slide, wine, tomatoes, milk, eggs, corn, coffee, butter, there was at least one research study that argued that the ingredient caused cancer, and at least one research study that argued that the ingredient prevented cancer. What are we supposed to do with this information? We turned to healthcare, same thing. We saw that the authors of the vast majority of clinical trials reported in top medical journals silently changed the outcomes that they were reporting. So they said they were going to study one thing, but they reported on another. Now, why would they do that? Look, I don't claim to be an expert. Scientific research is enormously complicated, certainly clinical research is as well. But one theory might be that the original studies didn't pan out the way they wanted. So they cherry-picked positive findings from those same studies on secondary outcomes and reported on those instead, so they could get published. Now, you don't have to have a PhD to start wondering whether maybe there could be something fishy going on here. And these shenanigans happen everywhere. Take a recent project that we did, the reproducibility project. So we asked researchers to reproduce 100 psychology experiments that had been published in top psychology journals in 2008. So go do them again. If you do them again, will you find the same results? That's what we wanted to know. You know how often they could find the same results? 1/3 to 1/2 of the time. Now, I'm not claiming that scientists and researchers are actively and intentionally committing fraud. I'm saying there's something broken in our system where scientists are feeling the need to report only positive findings at the expense of the whole story. How would they do that? Well, lots of ways. So let's say that a researcher wants to prove that there's a relationship between eating blue M&Ms and prostate cancer, because that would be newsworthy. So he designs and conducts an experiment, but he doesn't find a relationship. Okay, so he does it again, same experiment. Does it again, no relationship. He does it 17 more times, no relationship. But on the 20th time, he does find a relationship. Boom, he can publish. Blue M&Ms cause prostate cancer, new study shows. He doesn't tell us about the 19 other times that he conducted that same study and failed. He just tells us about the one time that he succeeded. That's called the file drawer effect. The researcher could also tweak the statistical analysis until he gets the results that he wants. That's called p-hacking. Or he could report us to a very narrowly defined group, when in fact, the original research study was meant to address a much, much larger group. Why does this happen? Well, there could be lots of reasons. But I would argue that a reason is that the incentive system in science and in research is broken. In an ideal world, scientists and researchers would be motivated by one thing, the pursuit of truth. But in the real world, scientists and researchers are equally motivated by the desire to publish, because that's the vehicle for achieving tenure. That's the vehicle for getting funding and for achieving notoriety. Scientific journals are clamoring for articles that report flashy results so that those articles can get cited. They even have a term for this. It's called the impact factor. Then, of course, there's the media, and we as consumers, we all want to hear those flashy results. And so researchers deliver, even if it's at the expense of full transparency and rigor. And we're all the worse off for it. At our foundation, we try to break this cycle and reform the system by funding organizations that are promoting transparency and good practices and collaboration and data sharing. The Center for Open Science, the Center for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford, the Metrics Center at Stanford, health news organizations that are holding the media's feet to the fire as to what they report on research studies. And they're all doing terrific work. But we need to do so much more. We didn't become philanthropists to hang out with academics and roam the hallowed halls of universities. We became philanthropists to change the world. But how can we even think about what to change if we don't know what works? And how are we supposed to know what works if we can't trust research? So this is our problem. This is our issue. This goes to the core of who we are and what we do. We can't function if we don't have a healthy research ecosystem. This problem of bad research and bad science isn't limited to academia. This is just as bad in public policy. Anyone remember the Scared Straight program? You know, at-risk youth would go to maximum security prisons or meet prisoners, and the prisoners would yell at them and tell them about their bad choices and how they had to live their life on the straight and narrow. We spent millions of dollars on these programs. And they made intuitive sense, except that they didn't work. Research showed that these programs actually increased the likelihood that these kids would commit criminal acts. We should have known this much earlier. We would have saved millions of dollars, and more importantly, maybe we would have saved some of these kids. 3 federal departments, the Department of Labor, HHS, and the Department of Education, have funded randomized controlled trials on social programs that have either been administered by the government or by the private sector. Now, randomized controlled trials are the gold standard in research. Here's what they found. 70% of the employment and job training programs that the Department of Labor looked at had weak or no positive effects. Of the 28 teen pregnancy prevention programs that HHS looked at, only 3 were worthwhile. And 80 to 90% of the education programs that the Department of Education looked at had weak or no positive effects relative to what schools were doing already. So we know so little about what works in education and in job training and in policy in general, even when we think we do. Take the federal government's What Works Clearinghouse, which was established as a resource for practitioners to determine what works in education. It purports to rely on rigorous research. Let's look at this research. There is a study that had only a few dozen participants. There's another study that was conducted over the course of around 12 weeks. Then there's a bunch of positive labels on secondary outcomes that ultimately don't matter. For example, the website labels as positive a reading preparation program because research showed that after going through the program, kids were able to recognize letters of the alphabet. Well, you might say that's a stepping stone to reading, so that sounds pretty reasonable to me. And it does, except that the website doesn't tell us that those same researchers studied that same program and found that the program had no effects on kids' ultimate ability to read. Well, isn't that what we care about? So we're spending millions and millions of dollars on programs that at worst don't work, and at best, we don't know, or we don't have sufficient data, or we don't have reliable data. So this needs to change. We need to stop. As a philanthropic community, as a policymaking community, we need to stop funding these programs and relying on this ecosystem that isn't giving us the results that we need. And I've got some ideas on how to do that, how to reform the system. First, more randomized control trials. Those of us who work with governments, for governments, collaborate with governments, need to demand more randomized control trials so that we can get evidence and understand what does and doesn't work. Second, we all need to follow the evidence. This is on all of us. Governments and philanthropists need to stop funding what doesn't work and start funding what does work. We need to hold our own selves accountable for these results and for this problem. This is something that was imposed upon us. This is something that we've created and that's on us to fix. And third, we need better data. We can't do research if we don't have healthy data systems that are speaking to each other, that are harmonized, that researchers can access to give us the answers that we need. Now here too, there are excellent organizations, both within and outside the government, that are working on these issues. Within the government, the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, the Social and Behavioral Sciences team are conducting randomized controlled trials, pushing an evidence-based policymaking agenda within government, and they're doing terrific work. In collaboration with state and local governments and the nonprofit sector, the Rhode Island Policy Innovation Lab, JPAL, Results for America, are all contributing to reforming this ecosystem by either conducting randomized controlled trials or working at promoting evidence. And thanks to the work of these organizations and many others, we now have some answers. We now know which programs do move the needle on things that we care about, like child welfare and education and job training and recidivism. Armed with that information, aren't we in a better spot? As people who care, as concerned citizens, as philanthropists, as policymakers, to make good decisions? We need to follow data. We need to focus more on research. And we need to demand that of governments and of ourselves. Because policy ideas that truly are worth spreading are the ones that work. Thank you.